Mr. Thompson here. We're looking at U.S. History Standard 2, which is describe the English colonial society and the development of its governance. Specifically, we're looking at element C, so within that standard, which focuses on the different methods of colonial self-governance during the period of salutary neglect. So get excited. The Catholic monarch James II took the English throne in 1685 and tried to single-handedly rule without Parliament. So James II was like, Parliament? I don't need you. I'm running this show. Parliament's all like, what's wrong with this guy? What's this guy's problem? England's Protestant, so not Catholic, majority was fearful of the new king's unrestricted power. James II also put the North American colonies more tightly under his control by revoking charters, so taking charters away, and combining the New England colonies with New York and New Jersey to form the Dominion of New England. Sounds fancy. Which was to be governed not by colonial assemblies, but by a governor and a council appointed by, you guessed it, the king. You can see how this would make James II more in control. James had control issues. James II was replaced by Protestant monarchs, King William and Queen Mary, who signed the English Bill of Rights as a condition to their ascent to power, so gaining the throne. They said, okay, we'll sign this English Bill of Rights. The Dominion of New England was dissolved by the colonies and returned to their previous colonial arrangement as news of the Glorious Revolution reached the North American colonies. One outcome of the re-establishment of the colonies was the combining of Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth into one Massachusetts colony. The colonies re-established their local governments with the transition of English political power at the time of the Glorious Revolution. In 1721, Robert Walpole became the first Prime Minister in England. His approach to the colonies became known as salutary neglect. Oh, what's that? Sounds interesting. Walpole believed that the colonies would be more economically productive, so make that money, if they weren't restricted by policies that limited their ability to trade, like the Navigation Acts. Therefore, from the 1720s up until after the French and Indian War in the 1760s, the colonies were less restricted in their ability to build up their own trade networks and govern themselves locally because of the policy of salutary neglect. As long as England was receiving the colonial resources they needed to maintain production under the mercantilist arrangement, there would be less oversight of the colonies from the English crown. The colonies had always been somewhat independent of English control due to distance limitations, structure of the colonial governments, and the greater proportion of eligible voters in the colonies. The methods of colonial self-government that existed during the period of salutary neglect firmly established a tradition of independence that would later lead to revolution between England and her colonies. England's like, should have never given you those freedoms. I give you an inch, you take a mile, colonies. The political structure of each colony by the time of the Revolutionary War consisted of a governor and an elected legislature. The earliest of the elected legislatures, the House of Burgesses, was established shortly after Jamestown's founding. Colonial legislatures, such as Virginia's House of Burgesses, had long traditions of making local policies and were made up of locally elected colonists. Taxes were levied by these colonial representatives, so taxes were collected by these colonial representatives and established the tradition of local taxation by locally elected representatives. Many New England colonies had town meetings that met regularly to vote directly on public issues. Voting in the colonies was often restricted to only white males that owned some land. Even though this seems like a very limiting voting policy, it included a far greater proportion of citizens that could vote in comparison with the rest of the world, even England. Religious restrictions had even been removed from the New England colonies' voter eligibility by the time of the American Revolution, which further expanded the tradition of local colonial participation in governing. There was also an expectation that emerged in the colonies that local legislatures would be responsible for looking out for the interests of all colonists and not just the wealthy. This concept played out dramatically in the events surrounding Bacon's rebellion in Jamestown in the late 1670s. Former indentured servants had worked off their debt, but could not afford land in the township itself. Instead, they had to move farther into the frontier and often faced conflicts over land with the area's American Indians. These poor citizens paid taxes and expected the House of Burgesses to provide protections for them, even though they lived further out from the wealthy Jamestown community. Nathaniel Bacon led these poor citizens first against the American Indians, then against the Jamestown elite, including the royal governor, William Berkeley. Bacon's rebellion between the poor frontier colonists and Virginia's colonial government established an expectation in America that government would work for the good of all citizens and not just the wealthy. The tradition of English colonial self-government began early with the pledge of majority rule under the Mayflower Compact and the establishment of colonial legislatures. During the period of salutary neglect, the role of these local assemblies and town meetings expanded. It was during this time that the English government, following the Glorious Revolution, scaled back its political oversight of the colonies as long as the economic resources were still provided to England. Political autonomy, so political independence, and self-government in the colonies grew to be an expectation and formed an independent American identity that ultimately led to war between England and her colonies. Spoiler alert, America wins. Woo! That wraps up Standard 2, Part C, describing the different methods of colonial self-governance during the period of salutary neglect.